Welcome to this Q&A session, Tackling the Age Quake. Although I think the novelist Martin Amis had an even catchier phrase. I interviewed him recently and he spoke very passionately about what he calls the silver tsunami. Amis warns that the age structures in societies right across the world, from China to Japan, Italy, France, Britain, are so tremendously distorted, with the old outnumbering the young, as he says, by 2 to 1 in a generation or two. There'll one day be some kind of civil war between the old and the young. The old, he says, will flood the cities like a tsunami of hideous refugees, stinking up all the restaurants and using up all the hospital space. And I'm sorry, Susan.
I'm waiting.
It's Martin Amis I'm quoting here. And it will be much resented because the old won't be paying for themselves, they'll be dependent on the young. So if you're flipping hamburgers, you know that half your wages will go to maintain the old. The only answer, says Amis, is to put euthanasia bars on street corners where those who opt to opt out can be given a martini and a medal. Look, as a satirist, I do admit he's exaggerating, but there is a kernel of truth to this invective. In Australia, the dependency ratio, that is the number of workers to the number of retirees, currently sits at 5 to 1, 5 workers for every retiree, but that is predicted to decline to 2.7 to 1 by 2050. By that time, the population of over 65s will rise from 14% to 23%, not the figures Amis is talking about, but then as we'll hear on this panel, the Europeans have a much bigger problem than we do in Australia. Government expenditure on health, aged care and the age pension will almost double in that period, from 7.5% of GDP to 13%. Well, the last 2 Treasury Secretaries, Ken Henry and Martin Parkinson, have both called for an urgent national debate on how we pay for all this, a debate we must have, they say, before it's too late. Well, this session is part of that debate, and I must say that AIST has recommended 2 critical reforms from their point of view: raising the superannuation preservation age to 60 for those born after January 1, 1964, and raising the official retirement age, the age at which you can take the age pension, to 67 for those born after January 1, 1957. Now, there are many other serious debates, largely ignored, I must say, by nervous politicians. But these debates are happening in this space, and we'll go through some of them on this panel, including the equity of super tax breaks, the size of the super guarantee, and other suggestions around encouraging age workers with skills to actually stay much longer in the workplace. The silver tsunami, however, is coming, whatever the size of it, and we're here to talk about it. So we welcome your questions. That's the critical part of today. So there are 8 microphones, I think. They all have numbers on them. If you want to ask a question of the panel, just simply put your hand up and we'll get one of those microphones to you. I'll see a number somewhere out there in the dim gloom that I'm seeing in front of me, at least I hope I will. And the other way, of course, is to use your smartphones. The AXA Investment Managers live Q&A is now open and will be for the duration of this session. So just follow the instructions on the screen if you want to text us a question or tweet us a question. I know from the past and from previous sessions, you guys are very good at that, but I'd like to hear live questions from the floor as well. So let me introduce our panel, very qualified panel it is, and I'll get each of our panellists to introduce themselves by simply raising one hand when I name them. Professor Rosalind Croucher is President of the Australian Law Reform Commission. The Honourable Susan Ryan, AO, is the Age Discrimination Commissioner. Dr. Cassandra Goldie is the Chief Executive Officer of ACOS. Professor John Piggon, ARC Centre, is the ARC Centre of Excellence, Population Ageing Research, University of New South Wales. Is it ARC or ARC? ARC. And Professor John Daly is the Chief Executive Officer of the Grattan Institute. And David Elia is the Chief Executive Officer of Host Plus. So we'll start with a question from me. And John Daly, I imagine that you actually stopped short of the Martin Amis-style euthanasia bars. But do you think that we are headed for some sort of conflict between old and young?
I think that that's a real risk given the way that our tax and welfare systems are set up at the moment. We've seen a substantial deterioration in underlying budgets for Australian governments over the last decade. A lot of that's been driven by health, some of it's been driven by the age pension, some of it's been driven by superannuation tax concessions. And what it means is that people over the age of 65 are taking more and more out, as it were, per person. Now, obviously, there's an increase in number as well, but when you have those kind of shifts that essentially mean that people over the age of 60 are paying very, very little tax, even if they're working, and are very substantially taking from the public purse, I think inevitably that's going to create some kind of tension.
Yes, why don't you hear the young getting angry about this? Most of the anger in this space is from people who are already retired.
I think the complexity of the system's got a lot to do with it. I will confess, I spend my life worrying about public policy, and we did a big piece of work looking at budgets. And until I did that, I was blissfully unaware of the size of the superannuation tax concessions and how poorly targeted they were, that they went overwhelmingly to old rich men, and that's not a very good piece of tax design.
Let's move to Susan Ryan. Now, this is sort of time really for opening statements, but let me ask you this. If there is a civil war between the old and the young in the future, will the old just repair to gated communities and just sit there and listen to Alan Jones?
No. No, because what we're seeing more and more is
He can't last forever, can he?
Well, he looks as if he might. But what we're seeing more and more is younger people understanding that they need the support of their parents and their parents' generation, as well as all the takeouts, Professor John, that you referred to. There is a great deal of input in terms of childcare, in terms of assisting young people, letting them live at home till they're in their 30s, all these sorts of things. So it's a two-way street, and the societies that are going to be most civilised and most successful and have no civil wars of any kind are the societies that discover intergenerational cooperation. There's a lot that young workers can learn from older workers. There's a lot that older workers can learn from young workers, and the really smart human resource people, and I'm sure we have some in this room, are understanding that team building between young and old is the way forward. But I also have to say this, that the tsunami, I'm very tired of that word, that we keep hearing predicted, will only occur if we don't change anything we're doing now. And the thing we can most easily change and must change is pushing people out of the workforce in their 50s or 60s, forcing them on to benefits and then the pension at a time when they are willing and able to work. Recent research showed that there are 2 million people over 55 who are willing and able to work and who cannot find work, and the main reason for that is age discrimination in the workforce. Once they're working, of course, they're saving more super, they're healthier in mind and body, they're more able to contribute. We are looking at a society of people who are not only living longer but are healthier. Older people want to work. I know there are people in this room who've worked well through their 7th decade. I saw Mavis Robertson down there, and there are others. People want to keep on working, and if we remove the barriers, then a lot of this tsunami catastrophising will become much more manageable.
Okay, well, as I say, this is time for opening statements from our panel. A lot of threads that can be picked up from all of our speakers, I'm sure, so think about your questions. Cassandra Goldie.
Thanks, Tony. I'm more concerned about the risks of the divide between people who are increasingly living in poorer situations and the risk we face on growing inequality. So I think to some extent the profile of what the family that Susan is talking about is a particular part of the community, and most of us are enjoying better living standings than we've ever done. That's the truth of it. And we do enjoy actually a very low taxing environment. So there's a very big group of people who are doing extremely well, but we have this other group of people who are seriously struggling, and they struggle from day one. jobs for young people, living on the youth allowance, which is $27 a day. If you struggle through the working life, you don't get any retirement income behind you at all. And increasingly, on the gender point that Liz Broderick was highlighting, we're going to see more and more older women who have absolutely nothing behind them. So this is the divide that I think we need to be really concerned about.
Really about the divide within generations,
that's right.
not necessarily
that's
between.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for young people in families that have nothing, there's no hope of them getting a kick at a certain stage in their life. I think this is great work that Grattan has done, that actually there are some reasonable expectations around inheritance, and some actually, the facts show it's not going to be as great as you think, folks. So I'm with Susan on the rhetoric around ageing. I just think we need to really say back off. It's a great story for this country that people are living older, they're better, they're more able to be in paid work. Fabulous story. And we need to then say, but we cannot go on the way we are with the kind of inequities that have been building up when we've got the kind of money locked into a super system, which clearly is overwhelmingly benefiting people who already have a lot. And who will be quite comfortable to be able to pass on to their children.
Okay, keep those tweets up, because I'll come to those in a minute after we hear the opening statements from everybody. Rosalind.
Well, I think there are lots and lots of threads in the conversations that we can bring today. The emphasis on tax benefits to older men, which was, I think, our opening point. Don't be distracted by that, because there are a lot of other threads going on, and if tax policy benefits older men, don't design solutions that only respond to that, because there are many threads. One is the unemployment rate. Susan alluded to this. If you become, the key to this is keeping everybody paying taxes for as long as they can, in part. Now, if the stats are in unemployment terms, if you're 45 plus, which is the definition of mature age, it'd be interesting to do a poll, I think, in terms of who is not mature aged in this audience, and also what your work aspirations are, because that's where you start to test the edges of this. If you are unemployed and you're over 45, the average period that you will be without work, even though you are trying, is 62 weeks. Now, that's a very condemning statistic. But the other side in all of this too, and it was lovely to see Liz Broderick in the opening slides, the unpaid care dynamic. You know, when all the emphasis is on people in the workforce, we're talking about paid workforce. Unpaid care is a huge dynamic. Now, many of us are in the sandwich generation where, and I confess that I am one of those. I have both my parents still alive, hale and hearty at 92, and I also have grandchildren. The unpaid caring dynamic is a pressure that needs to be factored into any of these rejiggings of design. And an element in that too is the increase of women in the workforce. You know, the stats aren't only about men, but and this is the flip side of unpaid care, because unpaid care has fallen disproportionately on women and probably will continue to do so. Not universally, but probably. And with women increasing in workforce participation, essentially doubling between 1966 and 2002, that is going to have an impact. And I think there's the policy arena is not just about tax and superannuation. We have to take into account caring, ensuring that people can continue to remain in the workforce and be unemployed. In other words, that we're all keeping to pay taxes, which will support an improved aged care system amongst anything else. Anyway, that's just a quick snapshot.
It's a very good start. John Piggon.
Thank you, Tony. I just want to start by saying that the age quake in Australia is not as bad as the age quake in many other countries. Other countries in Asia, where the increase in median age is far more rapid, or in Europe, where they've already arrived. And so when people talk to me about urgency and panic, and they say things like the age pension is unsustainable, I react to that. Our age pension, it's estimated, currently costs around 3.6% of GDP. That's going to go to 4.9% of GDP by 2050. In Germany, It's 10% now. It's going to go to 13% by 2050. In Belgium, it goes from 12 to 17. So the numbers here are far less draconian than the numbers that you observe elsewhere. We're aging more slowly, and we're in better shape in terms of many of our policies than our counterparts overseas, developed or emerging. So that's the first point. And I think that allows us not to do nothing and not to be complacent, but to be measured in the kinds of policy responses that we fashion over the next period. And that's going to involve some increases in taxes, inevitably, because the services that are provided by the government toward the older generation, which will become more numerous, those services are costly. Australia at the moment is at the cusp of what's sometimes called the demographic dividend. It's a point where workers who have parents who may be dying, unlike Rosalind's, right? So there are not too many older people, and they don't have too many children either, right? There's a very large labour force. And we're just at the point where that large labour force is moving into retirement. And then everything kind of flips in policy terms. Where you've got that large labour force, politicians can afford to offer tax cuts. Once you've flipped, you've got to go in the opposite direction. And I think we're just at that point now. And so the challenge that I see is to develop policy and to finance policy which will lead to something sustainable and something that meets the expectations of the ageing demographic going forward.
Before we move on, just a quick message to our tweet moderators. We're losing some of the tweets before we get a chance to come to them. As new ones come in, they're replacing those. I haven't got a chance to go to the earlier ones. So if you can somehow flip that around, that'd be great. Let's go to David Elias. Now, you actually manage a very young superannuation membership fund, and I'm just wondering whether your members are concerned about this dynamic where they're going to have to end up paying for older people.
Yeah, so thanks, Tony. So as firstly as a father to 3 teenagers and CEO of a fund that has a very, very young demographic, average age of about 28, this whole concept around what does the future look like for young people is something that we certainly think long and hard about. I am genuinely attracted by the proposition that at some point in time I will be able to recoup my investment in the 3 kids in relation to having them fund my lifestyle at some point in time. So we should probably explore that a little bit further. But the reality is, and certainly picking up...
Better explore that with them, mate.
Absolutely. I wonder if they'll look after me in retirement, so as I get older. But this whole concept around younger people, and more often than not we're talking about Gen Y, the traditional, I think, views is that they're lazy, they're arrogant, they don't care, they're never going to die. I don't think they're ever going to retire, certainly talking to some of the younger members. It's not really front of mind when they think about this notion of superannuation and the consequences of obviously not necessarily saving enough in order to retire on. The reality is, and we are living in the golden age of huge, shall we say, advances in medicine. Younger people are going to live longer. And Phil Rutherford's actually done some really interesting work in relation to trying to examining the number of hours in general that people work. And over the course of the last certainly 200 years, on average, males have largely worked about 75,000 hours per year. Now, in their lifetime. Realistically, I think younger people are going to work a lot longer. And that's a significant change that we're going to see play out in the course of time.
Yeah, I mean, do you think I raised this question earlier with John, and that is why aren't we hearing anger from young people about this phenomenon? We only seem to hear it from old people.
Well, they're just not interested. As I said, they're never going to retire, they're never going to get old.
My son has just taken up parachuting, for example, and I'm thinking, oh, no, that's not a really long-term thing.
Well, that's the reality. And I think that's where the onus then is on organisations like ourselves to certainly improve the level of education, elements around financial literacy. I think they're really, really important in the context of ensuring that people start thinking at a very, very young age about the importance of saving for their future retirement.
Well, let's start picking up some of the tweets. Can the issue of employing over 55s be addressed by equalising pay rates between the old and the young? An employer will always employ someone. Susan.
Well, some employers like to employ on cost, and some employers employ very young people, perhaps some of your children, because they can pay them youth wages, and then as soon as they're 19 and eligible for adult wages, they sack them, which I think is an injustice and contributes to our problem of youth unemployment and youth poverty. I noticed that there's recently been a decision in Fair Work Australia whereby, under some awards at least, that will be changed. And I think everyone in this forum understands the strength of the slogan, "A rate for the job." It certainly was very big in the women's movement a few decades ago. We still don't get it, actually, but in a general sense. But I think that changing the pay rates is, in our industrial system, quite a difficult thing to do. I think in many cases youth wages as such should be reviewed. I do think when someone's starting a job and they don't know how to do it, it's fair enough that they are trained and paid at a lesser wage while they're learning. But that could be a 50-year-old going into a new area where they need to be retrained. I mean, all those people, mainly men who are losing their jobs in the car manufacturing industry, they will, I hope, be able to find other areas to go into. They'll need some training. So the first period in their new area of work, they may not get what they were getting as a very, very experienced and skilled car manufacturer. So I think the pay rates really have to relate to skills and experience and not to age.
Let's hear from Cassandra on this. And I mean, you can pick up that issue or the general issue if you like, but just this whole point of how, we just heard a moment ago how long it takes for people over 55 to find work. There is a fundamental problem. Do you have any suggestions on how to deal with it?
Well, I think increasingly it's a shared experience of a range of different people, including young people who are really struggling to get their first job. And that increasing frustration, this idea is you just have to get skills and education and you're in. Well, it's not the truth. And in Tasmania, we've got a rate of 40% of young people now who are not getting a job. And then at the other end, older people, and Susan knows that territory really well, and there is nothing more demoralising than being reliant upon the income support system. You're required to look for 10 jobs a fortnight, and in the beautiful world of technology, you never hear from anybody about any application that you put in. So the mental health issues here are really critical for us, and if we're looking to save money on the budget front, the health budget's our big one. And so in this debate, particularly on the eligibility for the age pension and the question of the preservation age, that's the big concern that we've got, that if that's the only policy that we focus on today and in the debates for, to come, in terms of saving on our aged spending, the people who will be hit the hardest are the older people who have nothing, because they will be living on nothing, the unemployment payment, for longer with less and less behind them. So that's
I'll just bring up a tweet while you're on that subject. Medicine is prolonging life. We could live to 110. What are you going to do for 40 years in retirement?
Well, hallelujah. Isn't that a fantastic story? I mean, I'm sorry, but we've just, I've got my 50th coming up, so I'm on that line now, and I can't see retirement. Sorry to some people, but I want to be involved and engaged. And of course, I watched my father go through it. One day he was the most senior bureaucrat in the sales tax department in Western Australia, and the next day he had nothing. And the impact on him was really significant and in a very, very negative way. On the young people, look, I really do want to challenge the idea that young people either don't care, are not thinking about it. I think young people are very focused on the big picture and the future. The online world has brought young people into all of the big debates. I watched, and Tony, you'll remember this, when Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, sat on the panel with Tony, and she was such an amazing world leader because she talked about the complexity that we're traversing today, but she talked about it in a way that respected that everybody, including young people, could understand what we're discussing, and they can. They've got all the questions, they're asking all the questions, and they are saying, why is it, when we look at the overall wealth of Australia, that today in the paper, the pitch for getting young people into jobs is to pay them less? And I don't think that's the right message we should be sending to young people. You know, there's pressure down on the minimum wage case that young people should just get nothing more when we know that their situation is really dire. So they'll have a voice. And we are seeing it played out in other contexts around economic, you know, the G20, watch that space. There'll be young people, and a lot of young people out saying, we want to own this future with you, don't lock us out. So whether it's industrial relations reform, the debates about childcare, young people want to have kids too, but they're waiting longer and longer because of the world they're looking at in terms of choice, insecurity, etc.
Well, in truth, the young people in countries where this is now critical, like Italy, Spain, really suffering terribly at the moment, are much more vocal, obviously.
And I think this is John's great message of hope for us in the Australian context, that actually we're not in crisis. We are, what I'm describing at the moment, at a bit of a crossroads here. We're still the wealthiest country in the world, median household wealth. We still spend less on our social security system than anybody else in the OECD. We still have a lot of good settings for us, but we have some big choices that will be made, obviously, in this May budget and beyond, about which direction we go in. And I think that's why it's so great to be having this, a very important discussion, not to say we're just going to rule out talking about superannuation. We're going to not touch the age pension because it's too scary. We're all here saying we've got to touch these issues, and we've got to touch them soon for the right reasons.
I just want to make a point that we have employed a number of young people to wander around with microphones, and until now they are underemployed. And there's some hands up. I can see some hands up in the audience there. We'll take a couple of those questions. We'll go to the gentleman right down the front here first, and then the one who's 3 seats back. Go ahead.
Thank you. Nicholas Barr, London School of Economics. I hear a lot of important details about the way that tax breaks go to the wrong people. But I think cutting through to the main issue, Martin Amis is right. The problem is there are too many pensioners, and the solution is to have fewer pensioners. And the way to do that, as people have said, is to have people working longer. Age discrimination is part of the problem, but it's not the only problem. I was on a British government panel that looked at these things, and I asked myself the question, if I were an enlightened employer who loved older workers to bits, why might it be rational for me not to employ them? And there's all sorts of practical impediments, like if it's more expensive to insure them, or if there is a fixed cost for employing somebody, then that's death to part-time work. There's a whole range of small impediments. Once you've recognised them, you can fix them. So alongside age discrimination, there needs to be a look at those impediments to fix them. Once you fix them, then workers can work longer, but also more flexibly, downshifting, part-time, etc. Then you can start to raise retirement age very considerably. And in many ways, if we had indexed retirement age...
I know there's a question coming. But it's very... I'm going to throw it. I know exactly who I'm going to throw it to as well. So, well, you want to pick up on some of those points. I know, yes, Rosalind, you've been working on the barriers.
Yes, the barriers is the subtext of an inquiry that I chaired, and Susan worked with me on it in terms of barriers to work in Commonwealth laws. So it was a fairly narrow window, but it opened up incredible perspectives from so many people. And some of the ideas that you've just raised, I mean, one of them is the filter in getting people back into work or keeping people in work. Recruiters. We kept hearing time and time again, who are the recruiters? Many of them are young people who see older workers as their grandparents. And there's a kind of a filtering process that's happening. But what's interesting is that many of the people who are on the peak bodies of recruiters are now in the age dynamic where they're thinking, oh my goodness, that could be me, and are really leading in terms of trying to shift in code of ethics, professional conduct rules, that sort of thing, to get into the headspace of recruiters. Now that's a pull that will have to happen in order to keep the older workers. But another example that, and your question raises too, is in terms of, well, I'm the employer, I'm going to have all of this medical stuff and I'm going to have to do stuff around the workplace, you know, OH&S and all that sort of thing. Well, that's the wrong way to look at it. I mean, the stats are more that the older worker is actually much healthier, not taking sickies because they're in there, they want to work. And the OH&S adjustments, I think there's an example from Germany where the approach was not it's an older workers problem, but in fact it's a workplace issue. Design the workplace which is amenable to a diverse workforce. If you start thinking of it in that way, it's not an old versus young problem at all. It's actually about a healthy, diverse, active and engaged workplace. So I think it's to change the spectacle so it's not, the bogeyman is not recruiting older workers but a resource.
I'll just go to John because I think you said earlier that it isn't the problem that they have in other countries. So are you actually saying we don't really have, because I think the first point that our questioner made was that we have too many age pensioners, but I think you were making the case that that's not the case.
Well, I guess what I would say is two things. First, that it's much easier to keep a job as you age than to move out of the workforce and then try to get a job later. And I think that we've got to design policies around retirement saving, which is really what this conference is about. We've got to design policies which are roughly consistent with what makes sense for people's life courses. What you've observed, we know that people live longer and longer, but what's not always understood is that whereas in the first part of this century, those increases in longevity came from reductions in mortality at young ages, so things like communicable diseases and accidents. In the last 30 years, the increase in longevity, the increase in life expectancy has happened after the age of 50. Declines in mortality after the age of 50. And that means governments, employers, and families have been taken by surprise at how long people are now living. And I think that adds extra impetus to the idea that we need to start working longer and start shifting the determinants of working longer better. Now, we've had some recommendations and some legislation which has moved the age pension from 65 gradually in a measured way up to 67 by 2023. What we haven't seen is a movement in the tax-free superannuation access age. I would very much like to see that focused upon and a plan developed so that that moves up some. How far? I don't know, to 62, to 65, index it to life expectancy, something. Because that availability at age 60 means there are a whole slew of people who retire at age 60 and then think, actually, I should be back in the labour force, and find that an immense challenge.
Yeah, well, David, do you want to get in?
Can I just?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So the emphasis generally always seems to be in relation to addressing the question of longevity and adequacy. Let's play around with the retirement age. Let's try and increase that. I think as a key industry stakeholder, and certainly many of the people sitting here today, I think there's also an obligation on us to ensure that we're doing the right thing by ensuring that people who are in the system are in fact saving enough, and more importantly, are actually investing their money wisely to try and maximise certainly the level of retirement benefits that they end up with. And I think one of the key challenges that we have, and Nicholas Barr certainly touched on it yesterday, and Professor Knox, is that we're captive to a system, to a structure that allows us to misbehave in a way that probably is inconsistent with maximising and delivering the best possible retirement outcomes for our members.
Just point to the key elements of
of
where misbehaviour happens.
So I think this whole concept of de-risking, one's investment, as they get older. I mean, this whole notion of life cycle products that many of, some of our competitors, certainly in the retail sector, and dare I say some industry funds have introduced. So the whole focus is on risk, but there's no real thought given to this question of adequacy and longevity. And I think that's something I certainly challenge many of the people here to really think about long and hard. It may not deliver the right competitive outcomes for you, and I certainly understand and appreciate the importance of competitions, but I think broadly we have an obligation to think through some of these issues in a more detailed way.
What about that element that John just brought up, which is that the tax-free threshold, at age 60, you can get your benefits tax-free. Now, should that change in your view?
Well, I think many of the people here recognise that that's not sustainable over the longer term. I mean, government has sought to try and introduce, contribution caps. They've introduced an additional 15% for high income earners in relation to contributions tax. That's clearly going to change, I think, over the course of time. And the other thing that I just quickly want to add is that we often talk about there's going to be more people, shall we say, in retirement than younger people. What I haven't seen addressed is the extent to which government will look to shift current expenditures in the areas of education. If we're going to have younger people, so we're going to have less younger people, then I suspect we're going to be needing less money being directed into those types of areas. I'd really love to see the analysis that basically, highlights what that picture is going to look like going forward.
Now, stay with our questioners, but I'm just going to stick with this thread for a minute because I want to hear John Daly on this. Because, John, your Grattan Institute had a game changer report in 2012. You calculated raising the pension and super preservation ages to 70 would add $25 billion a year to economic output, or 2% of GDP. It's a pretty radical solution, though. I can't imagine any politician even contemplating it.
Well, I think that's one of the issues in this debate, is that we focus on things like age discrimination and so on, and all of those things are important. But when we look at what's the difference between Australia, where if you look at 55 to 64-year-olds, something like 56% of people participate in the labour force, and New Zealand, country otherwise very like us, where 72% participate. And the answer is, essentially, Australia has a much more generous and pension and superannuation scheme that cuts in a lot earlier. And whilst age discrimination and barriers to working are indeed an issue, they are, if you like, the demand side. The supply side matters a lot. And if you look at people between 65 and 69, the dominant reason why they retire is not because they can't get a job. The dominant reason is because they, quote, reach retirement age. So I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't worry about age discrimination. I don't want to suggest we shouldn't worry about those other barriers. But I think if we are going to really look at this participation issue, we need to acknowledge that the really big lever here is the age at which you can get the pension and the age at which you can access your superannuation. And if we're serious, then sooner or later we're going to have to start pulling those levers. And I would suggest so far we haven't been serious. As John said, we lifted the age at which you can get the pension from 65 to 67, essentially between 2007 and 2023. Now, in that 16 years, we've moved it up by 2 years, chances are that life expectancy, once you're over the age of 60, will go up by 4. So we're already behind. We're not even indexing it at the moment with what we've already done. And then if you look at superannuation age, we haven't really moved that materially at all for a long time. And that gap between the way that you can take to super...
Can I just interrupt you there briefly? What about AIST's solution to link it to birth dates? Would that make a difference?
Well, that's in effect what we've already done. Yeah. So we've said that we're gradually moving up the age at which you can get the pension, and it moves up, by 6 months every couple of years. That's in effect linking it to your birth date, and of course that's a totally sensible way to do it. I think the other issue, very relevant to this audience, is the age at which you can get your superannuation. It's worth remembering that people who take out their superannuation early, i.e. before the age of 65, are overwhelmingly people in the top half of incomes. So that ability to take your superannuation early does basically nothing for people in the bottom half. And so I think we're entitled to ask, well, given that that's where we are, is it time that we touch this really big lever? And it's frightening, but I would suggest it's an important part of the puzzle.
Who's going to touch it, though, seriously? You've been a politician, you know what this is like.
And I can remember. The thing is
They have this thing in American politics called the third rail, no one ever touches it. I think that's because the third rail is electric, but I'm not sure.
I think it's an electric rail, and everyone knows that simply because the numbers of people of pension age are growing every year, to suddenly change course is going to be, I would say, politically impossible. But it's not politically impossible to signal things and do things further down the track. As the previous...
so the people who are getting all the benefits now, that is us, they don't have to worry about anything, only the young have to worry.
Well, I think that you can't say today...
They call it the grandfather clause for a reason.
That's right. But and the grandmother clause, we haven't got enough grandmothers getting enough superannuation. But I mean, you couldn't get away with, politically, coming in with the budget that we're all waiting for, saying, okay, access to superannuation is going to be changed to 65 overnight. You couldn't do it. However, you could say, starting in 5 years' time, we will increase year by year, and we will look for some link, such as link to longevity or link to age, pension age, so that you don't get these gaps again. And I think that's perfectly responsible, but I would only say that if you try to force people to continue working when they can't get jobs, you're not going to save any money, because they'll go on New Start, then they'll go on disability pension, they'll get, because they've got sick, and then they will cost more. So you can't just have the lever of the age you get your benefit. You have to have the other lever, saying to employers, recruiters, human resource people, advertisers, society in general, hey, people in their 60s and often older are very capable employees. Do not overlook them when you're hiring.
What would it take to make that happen, by the way? I mean, apart from vision, apart from good public rhetoric, are there any legislative ways you could do that? Go on, John.
Well, I was actually going to ask a question. You're asking politically, how on earth do we make it happen? It is a third rail. I think, a jolly good budget crisis is helpful. And of course, moving pension and superannuation ages is one of the relatively few things that you can do that both increases economic growth and helps your budget position. And there's, it's worth remembering, Australian government's budgets are already in trouble, and they are going to get into much worse trouble over the next 10 years. And the sort of line of, well, we're not as bad as Greece is true, but of course, the big moral for Greece is we don't want to be there.
But I think picking up the point about what are the drivers of decision making, because in the end these are currently very personal decisions. Our view is that to go straight up to the blunt instrument is that for everybody we're going to tell you what you can do at what age. We do need to focus on what we're really trying to achieve here. Yes, economic growth is important, but it's important for a reason, because we want to ensure that people all have an adequate standard of living. So, for us, we've said in this budget that in this phase of transition to building up the resilience of the politicians, that we should pick up, for example, the Henry recommendation over the pension phase and introducing a tax rate on the pension phase, so it's not a free kick. That would drive some of the decision making around churning of wages in that transition phase as a basically straight up tax minimisation vehicle, very useful for people already who have a lot of money but delivering nothing in terms of accumulated savings, certainly delivering nothing in terms of bottom line for the budget. And we should also, in this interrelationship between the age pension and the superannuation scheme, we should be saying that we have to be prepared to roll back the expectations about the growth in the age pension. We absolutely back the age pension for people who get the full rate, who have very little. Obviously, it's very important. The great news from the OECD was that lift in the base rate of the age pension in 2009 has impacted on the poverty experience of older people in Australia. Alleluia. That's a great story. But there is a significant proportion of people, and my financial advisor friend said, don't forget to talk about all the people who are just getting that little bit of a part pension. They've managed to structure their arrangements so that they're eligible for it, and then all the benefits that flow from that. And we know that one of the reasons we've got this rise in the number of people on the age pension is because of policy decisions that were made that could not be afforded. The assets test on eligibility for the age pension is untenable. It is unfair that we have, on the one hand, people who are extremely poor, and on the other hand, people who are getting a part pension when you can own your own home and it can be worth anything, and then beyond that you can have investment assets of up to over $1 million and still be eligible for the part pension, and then all the issues that flow from that. I think, and I want to come back to, I can't see John Brumby in the audience, but where we've talked more broadly about what we're trying to achieve out of superannuation. I know Jeremy Cooper did his work on saying what are the core purposes of super, and they're plural at the moment, and we think that's one of our big problems. We look more and more to superannuation as a capital asset of the country, that it's looked at from an investment point of view rather than its core purpose, which should and always should be about reducing the experience of poverty in Australia for people in later life and therefore reducing the pressure on the age pension. And that we should have a separate debate about what we do with the 1.6 trillion in the system right now. And I'm not naive about where investment decisions would go if we just straight up get rid of tax concessions in super. We've got to think that through, but we are where we are. And I think we need to be agreed that that's the core purpose, because from day one in the paid workforce, low paid workers put money in and they're currently not getting a lot out at the other end.
Okay, you raised a couple of things there and I'm just going to bring up one or two of them. The last thing you said was tax concessions. The Labor government took a small nibble from super tax concessions. They targeted, I think it was fewer than 20,000 retirees whose accounts were earning more than $100,000 or more. Is there any chance Joe Hockey will ever have the political courage to go further than that, John Daly, or should he?
I'd be surprised if he has the political courage in the short run, but I think he certainly should. And there's two. Everyone talks about the super tax concessions and they come up with very big numbers, and I think one of the problems is that it's much too general debate. You need to focus in on particular reforms that you can demonstrate have substantial numbers attached to them and are reasonably fair. So if you look at the ability for people to put in money out of their pre-tax income, more than $10,000 a year. Now, by definition, anyone who's putting in more than $10,000 a year to their superannuation is not badly off. And those people, that tax concession costs us about $6 billion a year at the moment. If you look at the tax concession that says once you're over 60, you pay no earnings on your superannuation, that's a tax concession worth about $3 billion a year, and overwhelmingly it goes to people who are in fact earning in the top 10% of incomes. In other words, they've got other income from other places as well. So they're very poorly targeted concessions. Just those two are worth $9 billion a year. To put that in context, you could lift GST by about 2%. That's worth about $9–10 billion a year. So we are talking very large tax concessions. The objection that will come back is, yes, but those people will go in and invest that money somewhere else where they'll also get tax concessions. Well, and the answer to that, of course, is any
negative gearing.
Any financial planner who can find you an investment in which you can put your money in out of pre-tax earnings and then pay absolutely no tax on the earnings, I'd like to sign up, please.
Yeah. John Pigott, you've got a different view on this. Let's hear from you, and then I'll start getting questions back in.
Well, I think we have to be very careful with tax concessions. I think that there is, I don't like the word concession, tax preferred. I think there has to be, we're asking people essentially to postpone their retirement consumption or postpone their consumption until retirement out of their wages. And we're doing that by insisting that they really pay 9 and maybe going up to 12%, which is very substantial. You've got to give a carrot to that, and the natural carrot is to offer them a tax break. It's important in other ways as well. The competitor to superannuation for retirement resources is owner-occupier housing. It gets very similar tax treatment, not identical, but broadly similar. And if you made radical changes to the tax treatment of superannuation, you would find many people pulling back on their superannuation contributions and investing in larger and larger owner-occupier houses. This has happened in New Zealand, which had a not dissimilar system. I don't think that's good for the economy. I think you've got to think very carefully about the substitutions people will make. It's not just a matter of finding another tax break. It's what they'll actually do and what the impact is on the economy. So I would go very carefully with tax concessions. This is a long way from endorsing what we currently have. Can
I just put this to you? Are the tax concessions sustainable in the long term, or are they only going to really be given to a small group of people in a certain age band, and sooner or later someone's going to decide, oh, we can't do that, it's too expensive?
I think one of the arguments I'm trying to make here is that if you start increasing the access age, you're effectively narrowing that band. That's one way of reducing the tax concessions, to simply increase the access age for superannuation. And like Susan, I don't think it's impossible. We've moved from 55 to 60 in terms of superannuation access age already. We've moved from 65 to 67, and that actually is happening over an 8-year period in terms of the age pension access age. And when that happened, there was barely a murmur from the wider community. I think it would be entirely possible to legislate 60 to go to 63 on superannuation access age, tax-free superannuation access age. And if it were done in a phased fashion, 2 months a year, something like that, I don't think there would be an enormous outcry.
So
just to confirm, who you're talking to about whether there's an outcry, because I think for people who are on the lowest incomes and who have the least, there has been a lot of pain. One of the reasons that we've got it's a very mild but a 1% increase in people relying on the disability support pension is because those people who cannot get paid work and who are not in a position to get it have to wait longer. We have this unbearable experience for older workers who are waiting longer and longer because they don't have the skills, they don't have the education, they're treated as if they cannot be retrained, and they're waiting longer and longer. So I think in any analysis of the policy fixes, that's what I'm urging, that we make sure that this core group who are going to lose are front and centre in our minds in terms of whether that's the first place we go or whether there are other places we could go to get us where we need to be, which will essentially say for people who are doing extremely well, it's time for you to do a little less well out of the tax system.
I'll just bring John Daly back in. The question of sustainability of these tax concessions is, I think, the question we haven't really answered. I mean, I think John is saying if you change the tax-free threshold, that will make it sustainable. But do you think that's true or not?
It's a not inconsiderable modelling question that I don't think anyone has done the work on in Australia. To really work through, if we keep super where it is, if we keep the eligibility for the pension where it is, if we continue to see health blowing out as it is, where do we go, and at what point, if you like, does the system break? What we do know is that even if we just leave policies the way they are at the moment, then collectively Australian governments are looking at budget deficits in the order of about 4% of GDP within a decade. That is clearly not sustainable. And so we know that even on our current policy settings, something has to give over the next 10 years.
Sorry, Tony.
You go ahead.
Just in the context of this notion of the tax concessions, I think again we just need to come back to this whole notion that they need to be targeted. So I don't think anyone's actually advocating the entire abolition of tax concessions.
They are targeted at very wealthy people.
That's exactly right, and that's the fundamental problem. So there needs to be a fundamental redistribution in relation to where those tax concessions are largely targeted, and they need to be targeted at low-paid workers. They need to be targeted at individuals who largely have various breaks of employment. And we've seen, obviously, the current government effectively take a retrospective approach to really supporting the people that most need it. The other point that quickly I just want to make, and I just want to agree with something that Cassandra's basically said, and that is we've just got to be very, very careful about this notion of increasing the accessibility age or the retirement age. There are many, many workers who will retire on very small lump sums, and they will generally rely on those lump sums in order to pay for the mortgage. Okay, so any debate, any discussion about this notion of increasing the retirement age or the accessibility age needs to take that into consideration, and there may be a threshold level where people will be able to, in effect, access their lump sums, small lump sums, if need be.
Well, it's interesting because they do say we're reaching the point with the first group of people retiring with mortgages. The past, that didn't happen. Let's move on, though. I've had a very patient questioner waiting there, then I'll come to some of the tweets.
Good morning, Klaus Zimmerman from Hester. Really interesting discussion, particularly around tax and savings and ageing. The question I have for the panel is, I haven't heard you talk about the role of immigration as a policy debate in terms of addressing the ageing demographics. And I think Susan mentioned, I think you mentioned something like 2 million mature age workers who can't get jobs or underemployed. And other than Cassandra, who mentioned industrial relations but didn't talk about it, I'd like the panel's views on what they see as the role of the industrial relations regime to address some of these issues, because both immigration and industrial relations seem to be taboo subjects in the policy debate. So I'd be keen on your views.
Who do you want to address that to first?
Perhaps Cassandra, because she mentioned industrial relations, and perhaps Susan in terms of the underemployed.
Oh, the okay, all right, go ahead.
I mean, the industrial relations system is really important. I mean, and if we can't on the one hand say we don't want to close off any debate about superannuation, but say don't touch industrial relations, I think we always need to be looking at how it is operating in practice and whether or not it's delivering on its core purposes around protection of workers in the workplace in light of the dynamic in the workplace that's inherent in an employer-employee relationship, and also what is going on around the debate on productivity. So our position on this is it's an important debate that we are not frightened of, but it must be a debate that has the balance in it. At the moment we are concerned that it seems like the voices of young people are being there's no structure for young people to be actively involved in the decisions that clearly seem to be being made by employers about what might be best for them to get them a job. Their biggest concern when we talk to them is insecurity, lack of recognition, no power in the workplace. And I think in this debate more broadly about our economic challenge, of course, there'll be an immediate go to, well, productivity is our biggest challenge. And I think it's also the debate is one of our biggest risks, because the sort of people we're talking about at the moment in terms of wanting to be more in the workplace, and often industrial relations is where that debate goes, how do we open up workplaces for more people? I actually think and maybe there are people in the room who've explored this more than we have been able to, around the deep culture that underpins what we're seeing in the Australian setting around how productivity gets translated into a workplace environment, which seems to be harder, faster, longer, head down, mostly by people who don't have caring responsibilities. And we're losing in what we can do in businesses in Australia because of that very old way of thinking about how to get more out of what you've got. In fact, we want deep innovation. I think that the lowest paid workers in businesses are some of the ones who've got the best ideas about innovation, and our risk is that we completely take them out of the discussions around the tables about what can be done to improve businesses. This is a fantastic opportunity for us, and this idea that older workers, because they cost a bit more, don't have a lot to offer, that they are seen as more expensive, and I think that's why from the Commonwealth Department down through, we've seen fewer and fewer people, older workers, people with disability in those workplaces. What is going on there? Okay. So it's much more complex than just a straight IR.
Sandra, I'm going to interrupt you there because you've raised something that's in two of the tweets at least. And this is a subject that comes up quite a lot. Often older people are losing their jobs to make room for younger workers. Keeping older workers on thus hurts younger workers. What's needed is more jobs. And there was another one saying, how could we possibly talk about employing more older workers with rising youth unemployment?
Tony, this is a really respectable mistake. People have been making this mistake for about 130 years. It even has an official name, which is the lump of labour fallacy, and it is the belief that there is a particular number of jobs that any country can support. And it's just wrong. That hasn't stopped the French continuing to try and run their policy on that basis, but it's just plain wrong. What we do know is that essentially if more people work, then more is produced and there are more resources in the economy. That's the theory. And then we can look at the practice. We have seen very substantial lifts in the rate of female workforce participation across all age groups over the age of about 35 over the last 30 years, in the male workforce, particularly over the age of 50 over the last decade, and we've seen almost no change in youth unemployment apart from the last 2 years, which may well be more cyclical than anything else. So I know that there's this really big concern that, if more older people work, there'll be fewer jobs for young people. That might be true in the extremely short run, but it's clearly not true in the long run.
I think that was a Gen Y tweet.
Quite a few people want to get in on this. We'll start with Susan. I want to hear from Rosalind as well.
Look, I want to come in on it because I hear it all the time. After the global financial crisis in Europe, a number of countries came to the view that they would push older workers out, maybe entice them, so that the young could come in. it didn't work. What they had was more older unemployed and more young unemployed. The countries that tried to establish an intergenerational approach did much better. Germany, for example, benefits from something called the Berlin Declaration, where employers are given some incentive to take on young and old people at the same time. France has a similar scheme. And the OECD report on this is strongly of the view that keeping older workers in the workforce being productive is the best way of creating economic growth so that younger workers come in. And if I could just say something about migration, we do have a skills shortage in Australia. We don't talk about it as much as we did a couple of years ago, but we have it. And any analyst, Deloitte, for example, will point that out. It isn't everywhere, but it's in important areas. Therefore, skilled migration is absolutely essential to our future growth, and migration generally is one of the stories why, John, we have a better young age ratio than countries like Japan that have no immigration. So skilled migration is very important, migration generally is very important. When it comes to the growth in 457 visas, for example, I think we need to know that those companies who want endless supplies of 457 people coming in have really offered their jobs on the Australian labour market. It may be that they can't fill some of the jobs on the Australian labour market. I would be amazed if some of those jobs could not be filled by younger people looking for work or older experienced people. So we have to be very careful about the kind of workforce we're bringing in, but in principle, in general, we do need skilled workers.
Okay, we're finding work for these young people with the microphones. There's a question there. Number 4, we'll take number 4. Go ahead.
Yes, my question is a bit following on a bit from Professor Barr's comment. There was a young person who, went to many banks to try and get a loan for his business, and eventually a wealthy old man lent him the capital, and that was Steve Jobs, who created Apple Computer. Is it responsibility of banks and superannuation funds to try and focus on the creation of businesses and innovative businesses that create jobs for old and young people? It's a far better solution than tinkering around with tax systems or legislating people to do things.
So are you talking about the possibility of using the funds within superannuation for loans for businesses and so on? Is that what you're saying?
Especially where the banks are failing in this space.
Let's hear from David on that. I mean, is it even conceivable? I mean, your primary concern is to maximise benefits.
Yeah. So funds are not permitted under law to effectively just make it direct loans to individuals or businesses. But in the context of where we direct our investments, clearly a significant proportion of that has gone into recapitalising corporate Australia, certainly during the height of the global financial crisis, which really sustained, I think, the Australian economy to the extent that we didn't have the recession that we saw in other parts of the world. In relation to investments in the areas of innovation, aged care, retirement living, a fair amount of money is being directed into those particular asset classes, and certainly speaking on behalf of Host Plus, we're certainly directing more and more of our investments in that area.
The vast majority of what's invested is invested overseas, isn't it? I mean, from our super funds.
No, I think a large proportion, there is still that element of home country buys, but I think over time, I mean, we represent 2% of the world's GDP, so there's no doubt as the pool of savings continues to grow, there's going to be a disproportionate amount or more money certainly being directed overseas. But I can certainly see the day where, you go into a Bunnings style store and you can get a hybrid powered wheelchair and you can get all these wonderful things. I think that's coming because people are looking at the demographic changes that are taking place and aligning their investments to take advantage of the opportunities that will arise there.
John.
Yeah, I should declare I have actually worked for an Australian bank at one stage, and one thing that I certainly learnt when I was inside the bank is that relationship managers in small business in a typical Australian bank have enormous incentives to lend to anyone whom they think will pay it back. And to the extent that they don't lend you money, it's not because the banks have got some enormous capital strike and they're capital limited. Actually, they're not really capital constrained at all. The major reason that they don't lend money to small businesses is because the particular applicant is somebody that they're nervous that they're not going to pay it back. And to the extent you interfere with that, you do it at your peril. And certainly I would be very reluctant to see either superannuation funds or government funds lending to people whom Australian banks think are not going to pay it back, because they're probably going to make better decisions than either of the alternatives.
And I think this highlights the debate we really do need to resolve about core purpose of the superannuation system in particular.
Sorry, can I get you just talk into your mic a little bit?
If you take the view, which we do, that because of the shared responsibility, shared trade-offs, it should ultimately be driven by making sure that the people involved in the system are protected in later life, then the kind of asset class of investment is a very conservative one, and it should be. It should be, for the cost back to the government, if it goes belly up. And we can see how, because we're sitting on this amount of money, there is this pressure to get out and invest in infrastructure for Australia. But you can see the challenges we've got there because, for example, one of our biggest sort of backlogs on physical infrastructure is affordable housing stock. And there's been a lot of debates across the industry, including amongst the industry super funds particularly, about how that asset class can be built up so that it fits with your investment portfolio approach. But there's a reason that it's hard, because the risks are higher because of the particular policy settings around it. So this is where government comes into play in providing the kind of protections to super industries to be prepared to come in big time in terms of financing critical public purpose endeavours. I think, though, for the question of the sort of start-up and venture capital, that's a whole other area where you're right, we've got a problem. We've clearly got a problem. And as we say, because we're the jobs lobby as well as the welfare lobby, the jobs of the future will come from that kind of community-led work. The Steve Jobs, as you say, not from the big multinationals, because they're able to structure their businesses so they're offshoring as much as they can. So that's where the SME focus for us is very, very important. And I think you're probably right, it's a blind spot, really, in terms of big policy debates about how to generate the economic growth in that area for the jobs of the people we're talking about.
Okay, we've got a question down the front here, microphone number 1, go ahead.
Yes, thanks very much. Gary Humphreys from Energy Super. Perhaps I'm tilting at windmills here, but the adversarial political system that we have really prevents in many cases good policy development. If one side develops a good policy, the other side, even though they recognise it as a good policy, don't necessarily support it. I wonder if there is any chance that in the area of superannuation and the issues that we've been talking about, there could be some bipartisan development of policy.
Yes, I think that's a terrific question, and I think we should hear from the panel across the board on it. It's a matter of opinion. So, Rosalind, do you want to start?
Oh, yes, all right. Politics, Westminster system, it's always going to be like that. Bipartisanship develops over certain issues. There was the backing of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is an area that I'm looking at the moment. It was a bipartisan initiative. But
it seems to be evaporating.
Well, politics is like that. Essentially two-party government and opposition system is necessarily like that. So I'd rather not go into that debate, but rather, can I just shift it, now that I've got the opportunity, just shift it a little. I think there's a coalescence of a number of big elements going on here. And the difficulty in doing the statistical analysis, and I have to say I'm not critical here, I'm married a statistician, so I love them dearly, but it's, you can miss some of the bigger elements. I'm a historian by heart, and I think some of the coalescence, there's essentially the end of most of the defined benefit schemes is changing the focus of superannuation into, and I noticed a tweet about let's focus not on income, not on capital accumulation, but on retirement income. They're necessarily interlinked because of increasing longevity. If you are in an accumulation fund model, it's because you don't know how long you're going to live, you don't know how much you're going to need, you don't know what the exigence is in your life. I think that's the wrong question to ask. So to coalesce an end of defined benefit schemes, increasing longevity, the move of steady and inexorable move of women into the workforce, the impact that might have on caring, the unpaid workforce dynamic, all of these things fall in line, and we have to look at every element in that and not just focus too narrowly. In order to develop the appropriate political solution, it has to have all of those elements in mind, because a lot of the stats are on paid workforce dynamics, and the flip side of that is the shadowlands of unpaid care. And I think one of and the question before about industrial relations, I always prefer a carrot rather than a stick approach. My intellectual research background was very much in the John Stuart Mill self-reliant model, and and in an inheritance context, which was my research area. And I think one of the elements that is working to pull the dynamics together is good business modelling. I remember, Susan, your discussion with all the business leaders, and Bunnings was mentioned. Bunnings is a good business model, which is both recognising the value of part-time work, the value of experience, but permanent part-time positions is their business model, which is one that applies to all of the dynamics that we're talking about. So it's rethinking the business modelling in view of all of these shifts that are happening. And shifting the business model is also tied into the cultural shift, which all of us have kind of touched on in one way or another. And that's about the way we're thinking about workers as not necessarily old or young. Even the idea of retirement it's a puff. It doesn't mean anything anymore. It is about access ages and pension ages. Retirement age is a furphy, I think, in this discussion. It's more about planning for what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And anyway, sorry, that's a long-winded
I'll tell you what, I'm going to stick with you for a minute, and then I'm going to come back to the question that was asked, because you raised something very interesting there, and I wanted to bring it into the discussion. That is the psychology around inheritance, which seems to have changed, and I think largely because our parents' homes have become so much more valuable. As they've gotten older, they're now sitting on big assets, and younger people want those assets because they're sort of greedy, and they also think, to be fair, they also think that's the only way I'm ever going to get into the housing market. So what is the psychology around inheritance? Since you've studied it, I just want to hear from you on this.
Can I, and being an academic, I always think of flip side. Okay, one of the sides of that is staying in your home. Now, that was raised as an element, and the value of the home in terms of relationship to pension, that's a policy debate that has to happen. I recognise that. But if you look at people like my parents in their 90s, even the suggestion of putting a stair, one of those chair thingies that goes up the stairs, brought horror to my father's face. He can hardly walk up the stairs, but the pride, pride is a very important survival dynamic, and I think respect for that pride, compared to what happens in aged care facilities, which are worse by and large than going back into university colleges. And for a person in their 80s and 90s, staying in their own home is a powerful force for their own mental and physical well-being.
You just don't want to meet that old boyfriend from university when you're in your 90s, do you?
Well, let's not go into the sexual dynamics in aged care facilities, which is a whole other conversation.
Why not? We've got 5 minutes left.
Anyway, but the inheritance side,
bang, as it were.
the inheritance side, there is a whole lot of very greedy 50 and 60-year-olds who are occupying the equity jurisdiction in the New South Wales Supreme Court, who I don't think have any entitlement to be there. So can I just leave it on that, because otherwise I might get smoke coming out of my ear.
No, fair enough. I think we've got the point. We have only got a little time left, and I want to go back to the question. I want to hear from the whole panel on what politicians could do, are not doing, and is there a role for bipartisanship in making the fundamental changes which may need to happen? And we'll start with John Piggon.
Well, there's clearly a role. I think we've seen more bipartisanship than we sometimes give politicians credit for. It would have been possible to dismantle the superannuation guarantee when the coalition won power in the 90s. That didn't happen. It was continued to be supported and in fact, after some time, embraced, as the tax concession story illustrates. So I think we've got a structure around retirement incomes now, which is probably there for keeps, but it's the structural elements which are there for keeps. I think a lot of the competition, a lot of the opposition in politics will be around the parameters. Should it go to 12%? What should the tax treatment on earnings be? Right? And they're going to go back and forth. And it would be good to see more convergence on those because they're very costly. Every time you change a tax parameter in this, there's a grandfathering and there are additional costs in administration and so forth. It would be good to have more convergence than we have. But I think we do need to recognise we've had a lot of convergence. The basic structure we've converged on, the age pension, the superannuation guarantee.
Okay, we're at the point where we've probably got 30 seconds for each person. David.
Okay, I'll try and keep it short. Look, I've got some serious concerns about the broader policy, so we say, direction of the current coalition government. There is no doubt that they find that the current structures, particularly around industry funds, and unions having a role in the allocation of workers' capital has been completely abhorrent to them. And clearly everything that we're seeing in terms of the changes that they're proposing under the guise of competition presumably meaning that will deliver better outcomes for our members, I think there are some significant consequences that all working Australians will have to contend with if some of these proposed changes ultimately go through.
Susan. Some of those proposed changes, by the way, as we read in the paper this morning, may not go through, including the
financial advice. Good. Anyway, look, for all that, I think there is the possibility of a bipartisan approach to things like increasing the age pension age and increasing the superannuation access age if it's done further down the track and with proper respect, Cassandra, to the circumstances of low-income workers. We have seen cooperation, even if it was sort of silent cooperation in the past, and I have no doubt that both sides of politics understands that business as usual will not work with the ageing population. So I am hopeful, and I think we should all be engaging in our discussions with parliamentarians on the basis that sort of bipartisan approach for a better and fairer provision for older people is certainly on the cards.
John.
Look, we have a very proud track record in Australia of economic reform. If you look at the period through the 80s and 90s, the OECD has recognised it as really one of the great success stories of the world. I think it'd be fair to say we haven't done much in the way of economic reform for the last 10 years. We've had bipartisan agreement not to. And I think that's because, frankly, it's been a really, really good 10 years and our backs were not to the wall, so we frankly didn't bother. That, I think, illustrates, I agree with the other members, that Australia in many ways does not have a particularly adversarial political system. There's a lot of sound and fury, but you actually look at the policy underneath and it's not that different. I am hopeful that we will do better over the next 10 years because I think it is going to be a lot tougher. But I think ultimately we have political leaders and they are the leaders of our people and they will follow wherever the people lead them. And so it's our job to be talking about these roles and creating real public space and public pressure to start thinking a lot harder about some of the tough decisions.
And Cassandra, and I'll just I'll throw this phrase to you because it's de rigueur. Hang on, wait a minute. Oh. The age of entitlement is over.
Yeah, well, it's just surprising some. I kind of agreed with the Treasurer on a number of fronts because there's certainly some sense of entitlement around in this policy area, which is why we've got the seriously hands-off approach. And I think if the politicians don't get it, though, Treasury does. So they're our friends on this one. But I think we don't want to overcomplicate it, but I just want to flag this debate about the primary home. The core purpose is about getting control over where you live. It's not about whether you own it. So rent reform is desperately needed so that we don't have this obsession with the home ownership because it's not going to happen, folks, in the same way as it did in the past. Negative gearing, capital gains reform would be great. On this issue of the politics of it, I have hope, but I think we have to help them. So I think it's very important. This is a tough reform. You know, you thought tax was hard. This is this is tough. And so I don't think we're going to see in the short term the government bringing us all around a table so that we can love each other up and get some consensus. But I do think we could do that. I think I've been in too many of these panels now where we have more that we agree on than we don't agree on, that if we could actually set up some kind of custodianship, a bit like Jeremy Cooper's idea, but not with a statutory base because we won't get it in the short term, where we took responsibility, this is a shared responsibility over this area, and we've got to thrash it out. I think that would be a great next step for us. The industry, very powerful, the people who have the least who are not so powerful, the seniors lobbies, all of us to get in a room in a sustained way and come up with some of the policy consensus that I think would help the politicians to be a little braver.
Interesting way to end, in considering that those same groups you just talked about seem to have been fundamental in shifting direction on the FOFA.
Right.
So anyway, I will leave it there, and I'd just like to thank our wonderful panel and our great questioners and tweeters. Thank you very much.